My name is Jafar Hasnan. I'm a presenter and correspondent at TRT World. Undoubtedly, the war in Ukraine has changed the world we live in today. From triggering a massive food crisis to disrupting oil and energy markets across the world, the war has also raised many questions about the future of European security and most importantly about the future of the relationship between the United States and Europe, and that's exactly what we're going to discuss here today on this panel, which is titled European Security and the Future of the Transatlantic Relations. Let me begin by introducing my panelists. I have here with me to my left Ambassador Douglas Lute, former US Ambassador to NATO. Thank you very much for being with us. Professor Talha Kosei, a professor of political science and international relations at Ibn Khaldun University. And to his left, we have Mr. Ryszard Czarnecki, a member of the European Parliament. And we also have Dr. Neil Melvin, Director, International Security Studies, Royal United Services Institute. Gentlemen, thanks very much for joining us here today on this forum. Ambassador Lute, I would like to begin with you. I want to begin by asking you about Ukraine, which is perhaps one of the main stakeholders right now when it comes to European security. And it's a very simple question. Does Europe become a safer place with Ukraine as a member of NATO?
Well, not immediately. There's an intermediate step, which is Ukraine safe as a secure, independent, prosperous nation state. So that intermediate step is, of course, what the fight is all about today. And only such nation states are true candidates for NATO. So the most immediate question is, what can we do to improve Ukraine's chances of coming out of this fight as a democratic, prosperous, country that can be a viable candidate for NATO? But we're not there yet. We have an immediate fight in front of us, and that's where we should focus.
The fact that in 2008, there was a statement released by NATO,
right,
in which it was indicated that NATO would be pretty much happy having Ukraine and Georgia as its member. Do you think that played a role in exacerbating European security, and that played a role in triggering this war in Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea, and the war in Georgia of 2008?
Well, you're right. In the Bucharest summit in 2008, NATO leaders agreed that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. However, they didn't take the next immediate step, which was to offer a membership action plan, which is the procedural step-by-step movement towards membership that NATO offers all aspiring members. So they made a declaration, but didn't provide the mechanics for how that would happen. Now, I think it's interesting that just months after the Bucharest summit, Vladimir Putin invaded Georgia, and to this day occupies 2 Georgian provinces, essentially assuring that Georgia is not prepared for membership. And then in 2014, he took similar steps in occupying the Donbass, parts of the Donbass, and illegally annexing Crimea. So I can't establish a cause and effect relationship between the NATO statement and what we saw in follow-on years, but I do think that President Putin took seriously the NATO declaration in 2008.
All right. Mr. Czarnecki, let me come to you. The role of NATO, especially when it comes to European security, has become more important than ever before, especially in the wake of the war in Ukraine. I just want to get your thoughts on this. How important do you think NATO is for European security right now?
Firstly, thank you for inviting me for this prestigious and important and I hope influential conference. Your question is absolutely extremely important because we can observe the big crisis, frankly speaking, I'm not a diplomat like my neighbor, of NATO last 2 decades, especially 20 years ago. And I am very satisfied as representative of Poland that now NATO found right place in global security, and I think, in my opinion and opinion of my country, role of NATO now is absolutely fundamental, and I cannot imagine lack of real big activity of NATO organization, or like our French partners say OTAN, I will speak NATO, not OTAN. Obviously, we can observe also divided opinion inside of European Union. I remember the presidential campaign in France, and some skeptical voice also of President Macron about US Europe relations. But after last visit of President of France in Washington, I think France came back to right direction. I think now we have good weather for NATO, and my opinion about last months of activity of Jens Stoltenberg and headquarters of NATO in Belgium is very, very positive.
Okay. I just want to pick up what you said, that there is good weather for NATO right now, and I will put it to you, Professor Kose. It's good weather, but certainly it's not perfect. Mr. Czarnecki mentioned France, and I remember President Macron, not long ago, he had said that NATO is brain dead. Mm-hmm. So what do you make of that? How do you think NATO member states can ensure that the state of the organization is not just good, but perfect?
Well, I think he then revised his, what he meant by NATO is brain dead.
But the damage was done.
Yes, damage was done, and that damage was already there. I think the problem is that one of the foundations of collective security or alliances is the notion of shared threat perception. So in the last couple of years, maybe almost a decade, I think there is a lack of shared threat perception in the NATO member countries. So the basis of this agreement is definitely Transatlantic alliance, and US provides the bulk of all these military background and strategic thinking. So for the last couple of years, I mean, threat perception and long-term strategic assessment of US has shifted probably to the Asia. I mean, it may be longer-term great power competition, or the major competition will be shifted to Asia. For the EU countries and the European countries, I think France has difficulties in terms of fighting against their own version of terrorism. They want to project more power, and they want to stay as a superpower as part of this alliance. But once they are alone, I think they cannot project this influence. If you go back to Germany, Germany has limitations in terms of strategic thinking and military capacity. So they still have been constrained due to certain limitations of security arrangement. And the UK still is a very significant actor, but after the Brexit, I think their strategic notion, strategic thinking has shifted. If we come back to the countries that are included to the NATO and EU after the Cold War, their threat perception are different. I mean, they have a different understanding, different threat perception from Russia. So considering all these things, I think you have to project, you have to formulate strategy and capabilities, the military capabilities to counter these threats. So there is this fragmentation. So NATO is functional. It worked a lot. It worked, successfully during the Cold War. For Turkey, I mean, our major security concerns are related to terrorism, separatism, existence of the state, we don't get solidarity. We feel we are threatened by, our southern neighbors. During the, Syria operations, I mean, we had challenge with Russia and Iran, and Turkey never faced sufficient support in terms of security. So when we consider all these things, I think NATO is not brain dead, but it needs to revise, its threat perception, and there should be a new consensus among the member countries. I think U.S. still is one of the predominant actors who's defining this strategy, but I think it is also necessary. I mean, there are lots of reports about strategic compass, strategic autonomy to revise individual, indigenous European-oriented security, but none of them has, practically proven to replace an alternative strategic thinking so far. And the recent war in Ukraine also demonstrated the significance of the NATO. I mean, all these projects are important in the medium and long term, but for the moment, I think there is nothing to replace NATO. And I think the better option is to revise the NATO according to the changing landscape, changing the threat perceptions.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Melvin, do you think statements such as the one by President Macron calling NATO brain dead, and the fact that prior to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, the relationship between the United States and Europe were not very ideal? Let me quote the European Union's Internal Market Commissioner from last year. And I think it was around the time when Australia had signed a submarine deal with the United States and the UK, making France feel blindsided, right? And at the time he said that the relationship between the United States and Europe needs a pause and a reset. Now, keeping Macron's statement in mind, which says NATO is brain dead, and the fact that the relationship between Europe and the US were not ideal, do you think that encouraged President Putin to launch this invasion? Did it play any role at all in your view?
Well, I mean, there have been growing sort of uncertainties in the transatlantic relationship. Part of that has been personality driven, and there was a lot of, I think, a concern in Europe about President Trump, at least some of his statements, and an uncertainty that he personally remained committed to the transatlantic alliance, even if there was a very strong, still an institutional partnership, and the relationship continued at a very strong level throughout his presidency. Of course, with hindsight, even some of the remarks that President Trump made have had a certain veracity. I mean, when he advised Germany not to commit itself to Nord Stream 2, which was, I think, rather sort of laughed at a bit by some in Europe. I mean, with hindsight, of course, that was maybe, we should look at that more closely. But there is a deeper issue, which, of course, is this issue that, I mean, the US long-term security interests are moving to Asia, and there's no doubt about that. That's very clear in the recent national security strategy. And how Europe is trying to manage that relationship is causing some fissures. So, and this, I think, goes through to much of what my colleagues have been saying, is there is uncertainty within Europe about how to manage it itself. Should Europe try and play a third way? And President Macron, I think, is very much in the school of looking for Europe as its own actor. Sometimes this has been even presented as balancing between China and the United States. But a large part of Europe is not very happy with that. They want to remain close to the United States and even to some degree follow the United States on China. So I think within that context, sometimes Russia has been able to maneuver, and I mean the long-term goal of Russia has been to divide Europe. That's been very clear. They wanted to roll back NATO, and they've looked to certain countries to try to help leverage that relationship. Where we are today, though, I think is a very different point from what you're talking about, the idea of brain dead, that there is a new unity across the transatlantic community, which includes all countries. And this is a unity, I think, that is not just contingent on the war in Ukraine. It's a fundamental shift in how Russia is perceived. And that shift will not change even if there is a peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia, because now Russia is seen as a long-term challenge to European security in general. And this is why we see Sweden and Finland, countries that have had hundreds of years of neutrality.
Was it not seen, if I may interject, was it not seen as a long-term challenge prior to the invasion, or perhaps, let's say, prior to the invasion of Crimea, annexation of Crimea?
I think there wasn't a shared perception across Europe. Some saw that Russia had a certain limited role in its neighborhood, but now that Russia is seen as a threat to the whole of Europe, and then the invasion of Ukraine, and that's been it's crossed the Rubicon in that sense now, because countries, as I say, who are not even part of NATO, feel directly threatened that Russia could invade them, and that's not going to change. I mean, until the regime in Moscow shifts, I think there's going to be no real movement on the European side, and this is why I think, coming out of the Ukraine war, the security challenges are going to carry on. There's going to be a long-term question now about how to manage Russia as a threat to the fundamental basis of European security.
All right, thank you very much. Now, Ambassador Lute, certainly there is a feeling among Europeans at this point that the interests of the United States are moving towards Asia, towards countering growing influence of China in the region. And historically speaking, correct me if I'm wrong, for the US, it has always remained Europe first, right? For example, I can think of Pearl Harbor. Right. When the US went into the war, it was Europe first, and throughout the war, it remained Europe first. Has that changed?
Well, I think to some extent you're right. Geographically, culturally, historically, the United States is much more closely aligned to Europe than it has ever been to Asia. But the world economics has changed dramatically. I mean, China's two largest trading partners today, right, are $2.5 trillion a year to the EU and $1.5 trillion a year of trade between China and the United States. So those realities have simply shifted, and they reflect the 20-year growth pattern of the Chinese economy. And the 20-year effort by the West, led by the United States, to intertwine China to the global economy, to include China, this membership in the WTO and so forth. So this interconnection that has been a 20-year project has been quite successful. And the result of that today is that we are mutually reliant, mutually dependent, China on us and us on China, in a way that we never were before. And so I think going forward, that trade relationship will dictate that the United States comes to grips with China's role in the world. And as the National Security Strategy, which was recently published, indicates, and the National Defense Strategy, which comes out of the National Security Strategy, shows, what America hopes for is a balanced relationship with China. So to cooperate when we can, so things like the pandemic, climate, and the economy and so forth, right? But to be prepared to compete where we must. So this balance between competition and cooperation is really the mix. So I don't see, this doesn't have to come to an armed conflict. I mean, in fact, it would be a failure of American strategy if we actually come to blows with China. But this difficult balance, this walking of the tightrope between competition and cooperation is the path that we've set out.
Ambassador Lute, I was watching one of your videos, I think it was from 2018, and you said in that video something along the lines that there have always been disagreements between the US and Europe, but in the past, disagreements were over specific issues, for example, the war in Iraq. But now we are seeing differences between EU and Europe, to be more specific, and the United States over core values. Is that still the case? Or is it getting worse?
I don't think there's a competition on core values. What you see among the 30 members of the alliance is, in some countries, a drift away from the core values that have served as the glue for NATO for now nearly 70 years. The second sentence of the NATO treaty, the Washington Treaty, is that those who sign up for this treaty agree with the principles of democracy, individual liberty, and rule of law. And yet if you read, say, take the Freedom House ratings of democracy, done for some 20 or 30 years now on an annual basis against several dozen democratic criteria, right? What you see across the 30 members of NATO is a drift away from those three core values. And when we drift away from the core values, some of the cohesion of the alliance, the solidarity alliance, is placed in jeopardy. And I think we see that. We see, for example, that not all members of the NATO alliance participate in the economic sanctions regime to punish Russia for its illegal invasion of Ukraine. We're not united on that front. We see some members of the alliance drifting away from democratic values by way of interference with the free and independent press, interference with the judicial process, independent judiciary, and so forth. And those are gradually and almost over time imperceptibly dangerous to the alliance because they speak to the cohesion of the alliance as a whole.
You know, if I may, but do you think there are disagreements within NATO members, or perhaps the fact that some NATO members are not buying what the US is saying? Some member nations do not want to do things the way the US wants them to do it.
Well, look, the US didn't demand that any one of the NATO allies join NATO. This is not a colonial imperial project by the United States. This is today 30 independent member states who took national decisions to apply for and join the alliance. So joining the alliance and signing up for these core values that we've discussed began with national decisions. So I think what concerns the United States and what the United States has voiced in behind closed doors in NATO fora is a concern that the alliance has hinged for over 70 years now on those core democratic values, and that to slip away from those values, to drift away from those values, places the alliance at risk.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chernyshky, now, does the fact that EU countries over the past few years especially have increased arms procurement and measures for more autonomy in the region, does it reduce Europe's dependence on the United States, especially when it comes to security?
Well, I think that there is no alternative for a very close cooperation between United States and European Union on Europe in wider meaning. Obviously, truly speaking, Europe needs United States, maybe a little bit more than United States need Europe. Obviously, we respect the priorities. The Ambassador Lut told about the very big economic challenge, and we understand that Washington focus for Asia now, but we cannot imagine the future of our European security without very close ties with the United States. It's our interest, not only interest of my country, of Poland, but every countries in our continent. Obviously, we respect the fact that NATO is like company, and biggest number of shares in this company has United States, maybe Gold Action share also, but last few months shows that for example, my country, Poland, is absolutely frontman in this our common reaction for the situation, the war in Eastern Europe. My country is #1 in EU support, military support for Ukraine, third position in the world after United States and United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. I know that in Europe, in European Union, in countries especially like France and Germany, had big discussion, big debate about special separate role of Europe in security, but I think especially now during this war we must be very close to United States, and every proposal of our European special way in security can be good ammunition for Russia and Putin.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, a very interesting point made by Mr. Czarnecki. Europe needs the U.S. more than the U.S. needs
a little
Europe.
bit more, yeah.
A little bit more. Okay, let me put this to Professor Kose. What do you think about this? Is that true in your view?
Well, because
that's for Mr. Kose, but you can respond. That's fine. Go ahead. Respond.
Yeah. Very shortly, I think. Also, I'm not diplomat. I can say very truly that the role of Europe now is it's a pity for us, less than 2 or 3 decades ago. Role of Asia is bigger, and in this situation, we need bigger cooperation with Washington, and also we can observe that the United States has changed the priorities of foreign policy. His foreign policy, and it's the fact. Well, the question about our reaction. I think the better reaction of Europe is the closer ties with the United States.
Okay. Now, Mr. Kose, I would like your views on this. So, it's Europe which needs the U.S. more than the U.S. needs Europe, and that is perhaps primarily why experts say that Donald Trump was someone who who has played some part or some role, perhaps, in taking the ties of the U.S. With Europe towards a negative direction. I remember when the German Chancellor Angela Merkel visited the White House. Donald Trump and Merkel, they were sitting right next to each other. And if I'm not mistaken, Merkel wanted to shake hands with Donald Trump. He did not even look at her. Is that because Donald Trump knew that it's Europe which needs the U.S. It's not me who needs the European continent?
I think it's a wrong way to formulate this relationship. I mean, in the aftermath of the World War II, Europe and U.S. come together to formulate symbiotic relationships. So Europe prospered with the security that is provided predominantly by U.S. In return, European countries contributed to multilateral platforms. They contributed to open world economy, development of the economy, and they also functioned like economic superpower and normative superpower. So this symbiotic relationship worked win-win and for the interest of both parties. So, but in recent, I think it was the U.S. that was providing predominantly the security umbrella. So that was very important. And right now, I think the problem is that Donald Trump formulated that we are providing the costs, we are providing all the security, but Europeans are benefiting from But from the beginning, I mean, that was a relationship that was win-win for both. So he started to perceive the situation as win-lose kind of mentality. Of course, Europe become an economic superpower, normative superpower, but this does not necessarily contradict with the American interest. But once Donald Trump formulated this relationship in a more competitive way, of course, he has a background. I mean, he considered the U.S. has the priority to challenge China rather than, this Cold War is over, so we have new challenges, and under these conditions, what we are paying is not also coming back to us in terms of security. So it is the Europeans benefiting from the security umbrella, but we are paying the price. So, but I think this is a wrong. I mean, the rules-based order, multilateral platforms, that was a cooperation and coordination of U.S., Europe, and some other countries. So that may be some kind of frustration in some of the multilateral platforms, or disagreement on Germany's relations with Russia in economic terms, or some European countries' specific relations with China in economic terms. So I think he said, the understanding is that, it was outside of this agreement, we should cooperate more. So once European countries also wanted to have alternative economic and political encounters, then US, the Trump administration said this is no more useful for us. So I think, this win-win mentality has shifted into more of a win-lose or more competitive mentality. But this, this Ukraine, Russian invasion of Ukraine, again bring more shared collective, security sensitivity. So I don't know how this is gonna go. How Europeans and Washington will perceive and formulate this relationship. But I think there was a turbulent era, so which, for the moment, current President Biden is more, seeing this as a more symbiotic win-win kind of relationship, but we don't foresee how long this will continue.
Mr. Malvin, I'll come to you, but I think Ambassador Lute wants to respond to Professor Kosei.
I think we should be careful here not to assume that Donald Trump's a master strategist, right? If you look at the 70-some-year history of NATO, he's the only president in that 70 years who suggested that it was not in American interest to have this very close security tied to Europe. And the American security relationship with Europe is not altruistic. We're not trying to be good guys. It's in our fundamental interest to have that relationship. And I think, frankly, there were times when Donald Trump missed that point, that this was not a question of a transactional business relationship with Europe. It was fundamentally an American security interest, and perhaps especially given the rising competition with China. For Americans, there's a very simple question. Do we wish to compete with China one-on-one, or do we wish an unfair advantage in our favor? And by unfair advantage, I mean, with our European allies, we constitute something like 50% of global GDP. And with our allies, we present a security package that neither Russia nor China can compare. So this was all about competition. And it's best to go into a competition with an all-star team, like our European allies, rather than one-on-one. And I think, to some extent, elements of the Trump administration missed that.
If I may, what do you think about the Chinese team? Is it not an all-star team?
Well, it's not much of a team. It's China. Who are China's allies? Neither China nor Russia has anything like the teammates, the strategic teammates that the United States has, both in Asia, but also by way of Europe, by way of NATO in Europe. So I think the grand strategy of the United States, when all is said and done, is to maintain its alliances, first and foremost with NATO, right? But also our bilateral treaty allies in Asia, because it's in our interest, and it provides us the best form of security.
Okay. Mr. Kosei, you wanted to respond.
there is mentioning. But I think the overall distribution of power is different in comparison to 70 years ago, 50 years ago. So there needs to be rearrangement. I mean, the conditions and the terms. I think what US wants more self-sustainable European security, I think, to counter at least Russia, so that, you know, in this competition, you know, US will be more focused on, you know, the Asian side of this thing. So I think the conditions, priorities have changed, and there should be a different kind of relationship. But I think Europe is not prepared to counter Russia or counter other threats militarily. So that's a big challenge.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, Mr. Melvin, since we are at it, let me ask you about Donald Trump. To what extent do you think Donald Trump is to blame for the not so ideal relationship between the United States and Europe?
Well, I think, I mean, his personality was certainly very grating for Europeans, so there's no doubt that that was a factor. But, I mean, I would slightly maybe disagree with my colleague here. I think there has been an asymmetry that has built up in the Euro-Atlantic relationship, in which the Europeans have benefited economically from the US security guarantee and have not really been actually pulling their weight for some years on that side. And while I'm certainly not a Donald Trump supporter, I think, I mean, the message that Europe needed to step up was an important message, and of course, as we see with the Ukraine war, you know, was indeed actually a timely message, although probably it was the wrong person saying it. And this, of course, is the big challenge for the European side now. I mean, there is a stepping up around the Russia threat, but it is also, it's been made very clear that the US remains the ordering security actor in Europe. And so when the US leans in and sort of is willing to herd the cats a bit on these issues, of course, the Europeans can act very effectively. And I think what worries many people, that, I mean, the US obviously long-term, as I said before, it needs to pivot to Asia. It's looking to do that. And without that US sort of steadying hand, there isn't actually really a shared concept of European security that is held by all the European nations. And we see that those divisions emerge very quickly. So this, I mean, and the EU is not the answer to that. That's also very clear. I mean, the EU is not going to emerge as a defense actor that can collectively combine the European interests. So, you know, how is Europe now going to manage the question, I think, which Europe looking ahead needs to answer is, how is it going to burden share with the US as the US looks to the Indo-Pacific? And Europe is going to also need to make a contribution to the Indo-Pacific agenda. It can't just be a European actor. So we start to see with UK and France, you know, they're developing Indo-Pacific alliances. They're part of that discussion. Others are not. The China question is going to be a very divisive one in Europe. It's already emerging as the next Russia question. Many in Europe feel that they want to sort of stay away, avoid trying to take sides on China. But the question is coming very quickly, and it's going to come into even the NATO context, is how much is Europe willing to stand up with the US on the China question?
Okay, let me add one more question here. So, in the European Union's quest to move towards the Indo-Pacific, do you think it's likely for nations to take more and more unilateral decisions that could perhaps result in the dismantling of the European Union? For example, we have seen that happen in the case of the United Kingdom, Brexit. Melvin.
Well, I mean, European security is going through a transformation, I think, and we're seeing many questions asked about the multilateral framework. I mean, the Ukraine war, I think, it's a moment that is consolidating it to some degree. Certainly there's a political unity now, but the institutions themselves are still struggling, I would say, to respond to this. You know, the EU enlargement is essentially stalled. I mean, there's a membership prospect now for Ukraine and Moldova, possibly for Georgia. But when that prospect will actually materialize is very unclear. Can the EU deliver on that? Can NATO provide security beyond the eastern flank is also a big question. Is Ukraine going to become a NATO member and Georgia at some point? Again, very unclear. So how are you going to deal with security in that context? So we're seeing other institutions beginning to emerge. We just saw the European political community convene. I think this indicates that while there is a consensus, there's not an institutional format for European security that fits the challenges at the moment. the EU itself, we're not clear exactly, I think, what that means. I mean, the UK, I think at least in part, the UK Brexit, I mean, it was a very complicated, there was many factors in Brexit, but a feeling that the EU was not answering the geopolitical challenges of the contemporary period was part of that conversation, is that it's extremely powerful as a market and as an economic actor, but it's really struggled to become a foreign and security actor. And even in the Ukraine crisis, we see it while it's stepped up, it still hasn't really, I think, emerged as a fully effective security actor. So these, I think, are big questions for the future.
Do you think President Putin took advantage of those flaws within the European security system?
Well, I think he felt there was a weakness there. I mean, he was, as it turns out, he was wrong. He didn't understand that there was a political unity. He perhaps focused too much on the institutional divisions. He's made a strategic mistake, that's very clear, and that's going to carry on. But sort of where we end up exactly on what European security looks like, I think is still quite an open issue.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, Ambassador Lute, I want to bring this discussion back to NATO and ask you a very simple question. Does NATO pose a threat to Russia?
I mean, no. Look what constitutes a threat, right? So in American military doctrine, a threat is defined as the combination of a capability, a military capability, and intent. So you have to have both capability and intent to constitute a threat, right? And if you look at where, by way of intent, everything NATO does is defensive in nature, not offensive in nature. It's doctrine, it's exercises, it's force posture. And if you look at capability, before 2014, and now before the 2022 invasion by Russia of Ukraine, NATO didn't even have forces postured in NATO allies that had borders with Russia. So it's not as though there was no counterpart to the amassing of 170,000 Russian troops on the Ukrainian border before the invasion. There was no counterpart in NATO.
But to be fair to the Russians, we don't have a Russian on this panel right now. The fact that NATO wanted to expand eastward, it had released statements saying that, for example, I quoted them earlier, that we would be happy to have Ukraine and Georgia as members of NATO. Don't you think these were aggressive measures?
Well,
not defensive?
Again, first of all, the forces on the ground are what indicate an offensive challenge, right? And NATO has never postured, even today, the forces that NATO has postured in response to Russian aggression are not offensive capabilities. Let's take the Baltic states, for example. There's a NATO battalion. So think 500 to 1,000 troops, NATO troops, in each of the 3 Baltic states. You don't invade Russia with battalions, okay? So, I mean, these are clearly defensive, postured forces. And look, the reality is Vladimir Putin knows this. His general staff knows this. His Ministry of Defense knows this, right? And any sense that there's a justified position for Russia based on NATO force posture just really defies the facts.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Czarnecki, now you come from Poland, which is right at the border with Ukraine. And your country is most certainly one of the key stakeholders when it comes to the war in Ukraine. And, you know, the reason I'm asking about NATO and all these statements that were released by NATO back in 2008, I mean, they do play a role, you know, in basically trying to understand what's happening right now, because for the Russians would say that it was NATO that was taking aggressive measures by releasing statements that we would be happy to have Ukraine and Georgia as part of the organization, and that's why it took matters to another level. So what I want to ask you is, I'm sure you must have followed the latest developments happening in Ukraine. And I'm not sure if you have an answer to this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What do you think is on President Putin's mind? What does he want?
firstly, I don't want to comment Russian propaganda about the aggressive NATO. Secondly, I think there is no alternative for Putin now because he must have success, and we expect that Russia will continue this war despite big number of casualties. By the way, the number of casualties, obviously the war in Eastern Europe is biggest war in Europe after the Second World War, but the number of casualties now in Ukraine is smaller than in Chechnya, more than 20 years ago, and in former Yugoslavia. This, I think, interesting comparison. But the most probable scenario, in my opinion, is continuity of this war, and not for the ending, not peace treaty, but ceasefire, like after 2014, and not real peace, but military incidents for long term. I think Putin and Russian government will make everything for still annexation of Crimea and eastern Ukraine, part of eastern Ukraine, Donetsk and Lugansk. Frankly, I'm not so optimistic about fast ending of this war, and I cross my fingers for our neighbors, Ukrainians, but victory of Ukraine is, I hope, but it's not so easy target. Role of Poland, our membership in NATO is extremely important for us, but we are ready for everything because now Poland, which has 2 times less population than Germany, we have more number of tanks, bigger number of tanks, bigger number of howitzer than Germany, and we expect that our army in 2035 will have 300,000 soldiers. For example, Germany has now 170,000 soldiers. I would like to show that we are ready for every possibilities.
Okay. Now, the reason I'm bringing this discussion back to Ukraine is because I personally feel as a journalist that European security cannot be reinforced until the war in Ukraine ends. So, Professor Kose, let me ask you, what do you think it would take for this war to end? Do you see a possible end to this war in sight in the near future? What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, how to analyze this issue is very important. I mean, if you look at the Russian narrative, Russians will explain that, I mean, their major concern is enlargement of the West, I mean, enlargement of NATO, EU. So, according to Russian narrative, it's more lack of inclusivity in the European, security system. So we already, they may argue that we already established Helsinki Final Act and certain norms, and there could be some system working under. But if you look at this OSCE system, I mean, some of the issues has not been addressed, resolved, like Transdniester, Karabakh, many other issues. So unfortunately, the existing security system that would bring stability or the security to Europe was, to a certain extent, dysfunctional. And Russians always argued that this is, the expansion is against. But if you look at the European narrative, I think they may argue that there are certain norms. I mean, sovereign equality, refraining from threat of use of force, inviolability of frontiers. These are all violated by Russia. So, and this means that this is the end of the existing, security structure. So what we're going to end up is there will be, most analysts argue that there will be a new security structure in Europe. So will Russia be part of this structure? And what will be cost of excluding Russia? And if Russia is inside this structure, will it be functional? So most, Polish, Baltic argue that if Russia is inside, this will be dysfunctional and maintain, unrest for a while. But if we exclude Russia, then this may prolong the process of, tension, and the existing issues may prolong. And the other, I think, alternative, possible threat to West is Russia may be easily aligned with China, and this may generate a broader geopolitical landscape.
Which it already is, isn't it? Don't you think Russia is already very closely aligned with China?
Well, this may not be considered as an alliance. But the thing is that Chinese also doesn't see alliance. They want more of a countries that are bounded to them. So they don't see Russia, I think, the equal. Okay. So what kind of overall power structure or security structure we're going to end up in Europe, and what kind of power structure, security structure we're going to end up with the overall world? I think these are very much. So to weaken Russia with grievances may be an easy target for China.
Okay.
But if is there a possibility that the European security system incorporate Russia? There are so much doubts on this. So I think this is the basis of negotiation. So what may be the alternatives? So should Russia be incorporated in one way or another? So I think the existing principles were fine. I don't think there were any, Helsinki principles, OSCE, these were fine. But, can there be some memorandum, or a larger kind of peace agreement which missed in the aftermath of the Cold War? So that may be an acceptable solution to Russia. But would it make Europeans more secure? I doubt. So even if there's an agreement, would the Europeans trust that Russia will abide with these agreements?
Okay.
So there should be some very strong, I think, security guarantees that needs to be passed through the parliaments and all the agreeing countries, so that even if, even if those agreement is, confirmed, what may be the enforcement mechanisms? So
okay.
That's the critical question. So NATO has a very strong enforcement, and Article number 5. Can there be an alternative mechanism? So I think these are issues for negotiation, but the current stage of the invasion and current stage of the war doesn't allow us to reach any particular direction. So I think we will continue to discuss alternative scenarios.
Okay, interesting points. I want to put them to you, Mr. Melvin. Does incorporating Russia into the European security structure make Europe a safer place?
Absolutely not. I think, not at the moment anyway. That moment is gone. There was an effort through the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe to do that over 30 years, and it wasn't, I think as Ambassador Lute has highlighted, it wasn't that NATO constituted a threat to Russia that is driving this war. That's very clear. That wasn't the case at all from NATO force posture. And also NATO enlargement is not driven by Washington, it's driven by countries who want to join NATO. And so I think the Russians need to understand, why is it that countries want to join NATO? Why have Sweden and Finland decided they need to join NATO? It's because of the threat. So there will be no, I don't think, incorporating Russia into a new European security order until there is a major change in Russia. And of course things will happen in between. So the question I think now is not really, in a sense, how to build cooperative security. The question is how to build security around effective deterrence. And that's going to be the agenda for managing Russia in the future. And of course, this is where I think Turkey is going to be very important. Turkey in the Black Sea as part of NATO, I think we're looking to, other NATO countries are looking to NATO to be very, looking to Turkey to be very clear on this deterrence aspect of the need to manage Russia, because the Ukraine war is not an isolated incident. It's a pattern of behavior that has emerged over the last 20 to 30 years. And even with the ending of the Ukraine war, if you look at what Putin said before he invaded Ukraine, it wasn't really about NATO. He was talking about history, historical destiny, the Russian Empire, the ambitions to recover lost Russian lands, the Russian ethnic community. So, I mean, this wasn't a question about European security for him. It was a question about Russia's role in Eurasia and regarding its neighbors, and that isn't going to change, unfortunately. So even looking at the enlargement issue is not the way to deal with this now. It's how are we collectively going to be able to actually prevent Russia from doing these things again in the future. And I agree exactly with my Polish colleague that the outcome of the Ukraine war will not be a stable situation with Russia. It's going to carry on. And so how do we now manage that is going to be the core task for NATO, but not just for NATO. It's also about how NATO works with non-NATO allies and partners to build that security framework around Russia.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, certainly the idea at this point is to discuss how this war in Ukraine will end. Ambassador Lute, you served as an ambassador of the United States to NATO, and you're also a military general, right? So I just want to get your thoughts on this. What do you think President Putin has to achieve before he calls off his so-called military operation? For example, as Mr. Melvin said, his objectives are so general. For example, denazification of Ukraine. How do you what's the benchmark there? How would he know that, okay, Ukraine now is denazified as per him? And so what do you think needs to happen before he calls off his military operation? What's on his mind?
I have no idea.
That's $1 million question, isn't it?
I have no idea. It makes no sense. Strategically, it makes no sense in military terms. In fact, the invasion itself made no sense in military terms. So it's a series of flawed assumptions. I think he believed, perhaps was fed and believed flawed intelligence, having to do with his own capabilities. He overestimated his military capabilities. He underestimated the Ukrainian capabilities and the Ukrainian national will to defend itself. And he drastically underestimated the cohesion of the Western response. So it's very difficult to make sense of something that is based on such opening flawed assumptions that are really unimaginable. So I have no idea. I don't see at this point an outcome that takes us anywhere near the negotiating table in the near term. On the Ukrainian side, President Zelensky has been clear. He has what might be referred to as maximalist objectives. Every inch of Ukrainian territory recovered to sovereign Ukrainian control. So far, the West has echoed Zelensky's objectives. So it's a very high bar in terms of what he wishes to attain. And again, if you go back to what President Putin has said, it has to do with crazy things like denazification of a country that isn't Nazified. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. So there's nothing to talk about at this point. And so, as several of my colleagues have mentioned, I think we're in for a long fight. I think next year at the TRT World Forum, there'll be panels on the war in Ukraine. We are closer, in my view, to the beginning of this fight than we are to the end of this fight.
Do you see a scenario, Ambassador Lute, where this war could become like the one we are seeing in Syria right now, for example? It's been more than a decade. Do you think it has the potential to last for over a decade, let's say?
Well, again, you're asking me to look into a crystal ball, and as a military career officer, we're taught not to do that, right? To avoid that, and simply look at the facts on the ground. And the facts on the ground is that the tactical and operational momentum in the war has dramatically shifted over the last 6 months. and is now held by the Ukrainians. So if we were simply to assume a straight line progression of the last 6 months, I'd have to give the advantage to the Ukrainians. But they face some very tough military obstacles in the months and perhaps even years ahead. So the ground that is still retained by Russia is much more heavily defended than the ground that the Ukrainians have recovered so far. And ultimately, when President Zelensky includes Crimea in that conversation, look, Crimea is a peninsula. There are 2 roads that connect Crimea to the mainland. So this is a very tough military objectives. The terrain, the Russian defenses, the logistics of the situation going forward begin to favor the defense, not the offense. So while Ukraine has made tremendous and inspiring progress, it's a very tough road ahead.
Indeed, and let me get your thoughts on that, Mr. Chernetsky. What do you make of Ukraine's objectives at this point? Like Ambassador Lute mentioned, President Zelensky has also said that he wants to regain control of Crimea, but I've listened to some experts talk about that, and they say Putin is not going to give up Crimea ever. He might do some concessions when it comes to other areas of Ukraine, but Crimea is a no-go for him. What do you think?
We spoke about foreign policy. I would like to say one word about internal Ukrainian policy. 2024 will be presidential election in Ukraine and election to Verkhovna Rada, to one-chamber Ukrainian parliament. And I'm sure that Zelensky and his team cannot go back 1 centimeter. And they cannot accept resignation from Crimea or Donetsk or Lugansk. It's the mission possible for Ukrainian elites now. And the answer for your question, and obviously for Russia, Crimea as part of Russian Federation is the one of the most important aims now. I cannot imagine the real peaceful solution for now. I think I agree with Ambassador Lute. It can be never-ending story in this region.
It's a never-ending story in this region.
Well, obviously, ceasefire, and I can imagine situation that under pressure of United States and some of Western Europe countries, the war can stop for few weeks, for months, but I think we cannot expect as the Western world the real peace process there.
Okay.
I'm a realistic, not pessimistic.
Okay, I'll take that. Professor Kose, let me get your thoughts on this. This is not ending anytime soon, this war in Ukraine. The process is going to be very long. What do you make of this?
Well, I mean, the problem is that if I think that if we put the Crimea, I don't think Russia will ever give up Crimea and will use all necessary means. But for the rest of, I think, for the rest of the Ukraine, it is difficult to reach a peace agreement, but they can reach a certain ceasefire line. So I don't think, I mean, Russia made huge mistakes, but in terms of rational decision making, I think they now come to conclusion about better understanding about their capabilities and where they can reach. And also the other thing is that right now the Ukraine cannot defend itself without I mean, the weapons
Western
that are
support.
provided by weapons. So that's a huge limitation. So yes, there are increasing, weapons deliveries, but it cannot end forever. I think Russia is also, facing an issue. So I don't expect an agreement anytime soon, especially if we include Crimea. But at some point, this may turn into some ceasefire line if, Putin feels pressed inside the countries. For the moment, I think he has still popularity, but we don't exactly know what the Russian elite is considering and what kind of pressure they put. So if he cannot move forward fast and or he continues to lose territories he invaded, I think this will put a pressure. So, and also there is also pressure on Zelensky as well. He cannot leave behind any inch of territory, but at the same time he has to be a little bit, realistic in terms of, short-term achievements. So I'm not too pessimistic about the ceasefire, but pessimistic about a broader agreement, peace agreement.
Okay.
Not before election.
Yes.
Not before elections, okay. Mr. Melvin, now, the future, most certainly the future of the European security depends on how this war ends in Ukraine, and the West plays a key role when it comes to bringing this war to an end. And so far, what the West has done is mainly impose sanctions on Russia. I can't recall the name of the consortium which had conducted a research on whether or not sanctions are effective in stopping a regime from aggression. But if I'm not mistaken, as I recall, it said sanctions are not very effective when it comes to stopping a core military objective. Yes, it can hurt the economy in some way, but when it comes to stopping the military operation, they're not very effective. But what we have seen happen over the past 9 months is sanctions after sanctions after sanctions on Russia. Have they done anything in containing Russian aggression?
Yeah, just a slight clarification. I mean, I think the key country to bringing the war to an end is Russia. It's not going to be the Western community, and the Western community is responding. So, I mean, once Russia starts to shift its behavior, that's when the war can come to an end. I mean, I think you're right. There was probably an overestimation of what sanctions could do, because we've seen many countries have survived for many decades under sanctions. I mean, the North Koreans have developed a nuclear and ballistic missile program under heavy sanctions. Iran is going that way. But the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia, I mean, they have had some immediate impact, but I think that the key is going to be in the long term, because they are making it very difficult and increasingly difficult for Russia to face the challenges of what may be a protracted struggle with the West, which is going to be things like rearmament. Where is Russia going to get the high technology kit that it needs to actually rebuild some of the things that have been destroyed in the fighting? I mean, a lot of it, actually at my institution, RUSI, we've been looking at some of this kit. A lot of it comes from Western components. So it's Russian weapons, but inside it, it's microchips from Western economies or various things like that. All of that is not going to be impossible for Russia, but it's going to find it difficult. It's going to be more expensive. It's going to be slower. It's going to put pressure on Russia's ability, say, to export arms. So already there's questions about whether Russia can deliver on its arms exports, commitments to countries like India. So I think this is a gradual constriction. There's a long-term challenge now for Russia, which is it's almost impossible to invest. So where are they going to get the capital for modernization from? They've got a lot of rubles, certainly. I mean, that's because of high resource prices. But in terms of foreign currency, which they need, and foreign investors bringing new technology, new approaches, all of that is gradually being closed off. So I think the longer this goes on, it is more damaging for Russia, and it's going to become much harder for it to stay in the fight as we go forward.
Okay, we're in the dying minutes of the panel, and Ambassador Lute, I really have to ask you this question. What would it take for the West to get involved in this conflict militarily? Would it ever happen?
Well, if you mean by way of being a direct combatant,
Exactly.
I don't think that's going to happen. But the West is fundamentally involved. I mean, without the military materiel provided to Ukraine, this war would be over, and not in a good way. So we are fundamentally involved. We are the military lifeline. And frankly, the economic lifeline for the Zelensky regime.
What my question is, you don't see any scenario where perhaps American soldiers would be landing in Ukraine and fighting on behalf of the Ukrainians?
No,
No.
I don't see that.
All right. Well, gentlemen, unfortunately, we are out of time. Ambassador Lute, Mr. Chernitsky, Professor Kose, and Mr. Melvin, thank you very much for talking to us here on TRT World Forum, and thanks to all of you for listening. All right. Thank you.